Tonight we invite you to close your eyes, to settle into your space, and to let the noise of the present day gently fade away. There is nothing for you to do now, nothing to solve, nothing to consider, except the quiet journey we are about to take together. We are traveling back through the veils of time, to a world of sun-baked stone, of shimmering waters, and of quiet, persistent ambition. Imagine yourself drifting, not on a sea, but on the currents of history itself. We are going to a place and a time that feels both epic and deeply personal. We are going to the world of Cleopatra, but we will not be speaking of the grand, dramatic moments you might know from films or legends. Instead, we will explore the quiet truths that existed beneath the surface, the hidden realities of her world, and the subtle, often unseen forces that shaped her destiny. Tonight, we are not in search of excitement. We are in search of understanding. We will wander through the streets of her city, feel the rhythm of the life-giving river that sustained her kingdom, and begin to grasp the immense weight of the world she was born into. So take a slow, deep breath. Let your body feel heavy and relaxed, and allow your mind to drift back with me to the hidden world of Cleopatra. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, I'd really appreciate a quick like, or even a subscribe. It helps our small community of quiet history lovers grow more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so feel free to drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see our global community connecting through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the world that created her. Her story does not begin with a dramatic entrance onto the world stage, but with the quiet, daily realities of her kingdom. Imagine, if you will, the land of Egypt in the 1st century BCE. It is an ancient land, a kingdom that has already seen millennia of pharaohs, of gods, and of dynasties rise and fall. The weight of this history is everywhere. In the towering temples, their stones darkened with age, in the silent gaze of the sphinxes, and in the very soil which for thousands of years has been renewed by the same predictable rhythm. This is the rhythm of the Nile. Long before Cleopatra, long before her Ptolemaic ancestors, the Nile was the heart of Egypt. It was, and is, the world's longest river, a serene, life-giving artery flowing through an otherwise vast and unforgiving desert. The ancient Egyptians called the fertile valley Kemet, the Black Land, for the rich, dark silt the river deposited each year during its annual flood. This silt was the source of all life, all wealth, all stability. Beyond this narrow strip of black, fertile earth lay the Deshret, the Red Land, the endless sun-scorched desert, a place associated with chaos and death. To live in Egypt was to live in a world defined by this stark contrast, a world of life surrounded by oblivion. The rhythm of the Nile dictated the rhythm of life itself. The year was divided into 3 seasons, each tied to the river's behavior. There was Akhet, the season of inundation, when the river would swell and overflow its banks, covering the fields in a placid, life-renewing sheet of water. This was followed by Pere, the season of emergence, when the waters would recede, leaving behind the precious black mud, ready for ploughing and sowing. And finally, there was Shemu, the season of the harvest, a time of low water and scorching sun, when the crops were gathered before the cycle began anew. This was a pattern that had been repeated for thousands of years, a comforting, reliable constant in a world that was, in Cleopatra's time, becoming increasingly uncertain. Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family that was not ethnically Egyptian. They were Macedonian Greeks, descended from Ptolemy the Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was seen not as an invader, but as a liberator from the harsh rule of the Persians. He respected the ancient traditions, and after his untimely death, his general Ptolemy took control of this prized land. For nearly 3 centuries, this Greek dynasty ruled Egypt, but they did so in a careful, calculated way. They ruled as pharaohs, adopting the ancient titles and portraying themselves on temple walls in the traditional Egyptian style, making offerings to the ancient gods. They lavished funds on the priesthoods and built magnificent new temples, like the ones at Dendera and Edfu, that stand to this day as some of the best preserved monuments of ancient Egypt. Yet, in their heart of hearts, and in the center of their power, they remained distinctly Hellenistic, or Greek. This created a fascinating and complex cultural landscape. In the countryside, along the Nile, traditional Egyptian life continued much as it had for centuries. Farmers worked their fields, artisans crafted their wares, and priests tended to the ancient gods like Horus, Osiris, and Isis. The Egyptian language, in its demotic form, was the language of daily life for most of the population. But then there was Alexandria. Imagine yourself now, standing on the shores of the Mediterranean, looking upon the capital city of Cleopatra's kingdom. Alexandria was not like the ancient dusty cities of the south. It was a new city founded by Alexander the Great himself. It was a jewel of the Hellenistic world, a vibrant, cosmopolitan metropolis designed with a Greek grid street plan. Its population may have approached 1 million people, a staggering size for the ancient world. Here, the dominant language was Koine Greek, the common tongue of the eastern Mediterranean. The air was not just thick with the scent of sea salt and exotic spices from the bustling port, but with the energy of commerce, learning, and political intrigue. The city was a spectacle of opulence. Broad avenues lined with colonnades provided shade from the relentless sun. The royal quarter, a vast section of the city, contained the palaces, temples, and gardens of the Ptolemaic rulers. Here, the architecture was a breathtaking fusion of Greek and Egyptian styles. You might see a temple dedicated to a traditional Egyptian god, but built with soaring Corinthian columns. Or you might see a statue of a Ptolemaic queen, carved from Egyptian granite, but with a classical Greek face and hairstyle. This blending, this syncretism, was the hallmark of Ptolemaic culture. They even created a new god, Serapis, who combined aspects of the Egyptian god, Osiris, with Greek gods like Zeus, in an effort to unify their diverse subjects. At the heart of Alexandria's intellectual life was the legendary Mausion, or Shrine of the Muses, and its even more famous Great Library. This was the scholarly center of the entire Mediterranean world. Scholars, poets, mathematicians, and astronomers flocked to Alexandria, supported by the patronage of the Ptolemies. They came to study the hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls that held the collected knowledge of the ancient world. It was here that Euclid developed the principles of geometry, where Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, and where the Hebrew Bible was first translated into Greek. The city hummed with intellectual curiosity, a stark contrast to the quiet, unchanging traditions of the Nile Valley. Cleopatra's palace itself was a world unto its own. Located on the island of Antihodos within the city's harbour, it was a sprawling complex of lavish halls, royal apartments, and lush, shaded gardens. Part of this opulent complex is now submerged beneath the sea, lost to earthquakes and the shifting coastline. Underwater archaeologists have found remnants of grand columns, sphinxes, and statues that hint at the grandeur that once was. Imagine the life within those walls. A court that spoke Greek, that read Greek philosophy and poetry, but that also observed the ancient rituals required of an Egyptian pharaoh. Cleopatra herself was a product of this dual world. Unlike her recent ancestors, she took the time to learn the Egyptian language, a gesture that would have endeared her to her native subjects. She was a scholar, educated in the Greek tradition, but also presented herself to her people as the living incarnation of the goddess Isis. This delicate balance between Greek and Egyptian, between innovation and tradition, between Alexandria and the Nile, was the internal reality of Cleopatra's kingdom. But there was another, far more ominous reality pressing in from the outside. To the west, across the Mediterranean, a new power was rising, a power with an insatiable appetite for conquest and control. This power was Rome. Throughout Cleopatra's youth, the shadow of Rome grew longer and darker. Rome was not a distant threat. It was an ever-present factor in Egyptian politics. The later Ptolemaic dynasty had been weakened by bitter family rivalries, with siblings often warring against each other for the throne. This internal strife made Egypt vulnerable, and increasingly, the Ptolemies looked to Rome to act as a protector, a kingmaker, and an arbiter of their disputes. But Rome's protection came at a steep price. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy V Auletes, had paid enormous bribes to Roman leaders like Julius Caesar to secure his throne, plunging the kingdom into massive debt. Imagine the feeling within the Alexandrian court. The news from the port would be filled with talk of Roman legions, of Roman civil wars, and of Roman generals whose ambitions seemed to have no bounds. The world was changing, and the relatively self-contained kingdom of Egypt could no longer remain isolated. Rome's influence was not just a distant political pressure, It was a looming reality that dictated policy, drained the treasury, and created a constant, low-level anxiety. Egypt was, by this point, a Roman client state, theoretically independent, but in practice, deeply reliant on Roman goodwill. Its immense wealth, particularly its grain production, which could feed the burgeoning population of Rome, made it a prize that Rome would not, and could not, ignore. This was the world Cleopatra inherited, a kingdom with a glorious ancient past, yet ruled by a foreign dynasty. A culture that was a delicate and sometimes tense fusion of Egyptian and Greek traditions. A capital city of unparalleled wealth and intellectual brilliance, yet a countryside steeped in timeless agricultural rhythms. And most pressingly, an independent kingdom that was slowly, inexorably, being drawn into the gravitational pull of the Roman Republic. She ascended to a throne that was not just unstable due to family infighting, but was also standing on a geopolitical fault line. Her every decision, every alliance, every ambition would have to be weighed against this complex and dangerous reality. The hidden truth of Cleopatra's story is not just one of romance, but one of a brilliant and determined ruler navigating a world of immense cultural complexity and overwhelming external pressure. A world where the quiet, steady rhythm of the Nile was about to be disrupted by the relentless marching footsteps of Rome. The immense pressure from Rome, that vast, abstract force we spoke of, was not just a matter of foreign policy. It seeped into the very foundations of the Ptolemaic throne, exacerbating the cracks that already existed within the royal family itself. To truly understand the stage upon which Cleopatra's fate would be decided, we must turn our gaze inward, away from the grand sweep of geopolitics, and into the quiet, tense corridors of the Alexandrian palace. The delicate balance of power in Egypt was shattered not by a foreign invasion, but by a domestic arrangement laid out in a will. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Thorntinth or Latus, had a difficult and often precarious reign, propped up only by his costly deference to Rome. He understood the weakness of his kingdom and the ambition of his children. In his final testament, he sought to ensure stability by tethering his most formidable child to her younger brother. He decreed that his kingdom should pass jointly to his eldest daughter, Cleopatra, then a young woman of 18, and his eldest son, Ptolemy XIII, a boy of only 10. They were to marry, following the tradition of their dynasty, and rule as co-regents. And, in a move that revealed the true master of Egypt's fate, he appointed the Roman Republic as the official executor of his will and the guardian of his children. Imagine the situation from Cleopatra's perspective. She was young, yes, but she was exceptionally well-educated, intelligent, and keenly aware of the world she inhabited. She was fluent in multiple languages, including, uniquely for her dynasty, the native Egyptian tongue. She had watched her father navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics and the fickle loyalties of the Alexandrian court. Now, she was declared queen, but she was shackled to a child, a brother, husband, who was king in name only. The true power behind her young brother's throne resided not with the boy himself, but with a trio of influential and ambitious court officials. There was Pothinus, a powerful eunuch who held the position of chief minister and controlled the kingdom's vast treasury. There was Achilles, the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army, a man who held the loyalty of the thousands of soldiers stationed in and around Alexandria. And there was Theodotus of Chios, the young king's tutor, who provided the intellectual justification for their political maneuvers. This triumvirate saw the young, pliable Ptolemy XIII as their key to power. They viewed his older sister, with her sharp mind and independent spirit, not as a co-ruler, but as an obstacle. From the very beginning of their joint reign, a quiet but intense struggle for dominance began. It was not a war of loud proclamations, but of subtle gestures and administrative chess moves. Cleopatra, seeking to assert her seniority and rightful authority, began to issue decrees and mint coins that bore her image and name alone, omitting that of her brother. In the patriarchal world of the Hellenistic courts, this was a bold and unconventional act. It was a clear statement that she intended to be the primary ruler, not merely a regent for a boy who would one day supplant her. This assertion of independence was precisely what Pothinus and his faction feared. They began to work against her, subtly at first, then with increasing openness. They used her gender as a weapon, whispering in the halls of the palace and the public squares of Alexandria that it was unnatural for a woman to hold such singular power. They cultivated the young Ptolemy III's resentment, stoking his sense of royal prerogative and turning him against the sister who sought to overshadow him. They controlled the levers of state, the money and the military, and they began to systematically isolate her. The city of Alexandria itself was a volatile player in this drama. Its population, a diverse and often unruly mix of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and other nationalities, could be whipped into a frenzy by skillful political actors. Pothinus and Achilles used their influence to turn the powerful Alexandrian mob against their queen. Small grievances were magnified, and her strong-willed actions were portrayed as arrogant and tyrannical. The atmosphere in the royal quarter grew heavy with intrigue and menace. The delicate dance of co-rule had failed. The quiet corridors now echoed with conspiracy. Sensing her position in the capital becoming untenable and likely fearing for her life, Cleopatra made a strategic decision. Sometime around the year 49 BCE, she was forced out of Alexandria. But she did not flee into obscurity. This was not an abdication, it was a tactical retreat. She traveled east into the Roman province of Syria, a region where her family had long-standing connections. There she began to do what any deposed monarch with powerful ambition would do. She started to raise an army. Using her own resources and her considerable charisma, she gathered a force of mercenaries, preparing to return to Egypt and claim her throne not by legal decree, but by force of arms. By 48 BC, the land of the Nile was in a state of civil war. The quiet, predictable rhythm of the river was now overshadowed by the tramp of marching soldiers. Two Egyptian armies, both flying the banner of the Ptolemies, faced each other across the sands near the eastern frontier fortress of Pelusium. On one side was the official army of Egypt, commanded by Achilles, fighting in the name of King Ptolemy III. On the other was the new army raised by Cleopatra, fighting for the cause of their exiled queen. The kingdom was divided, poised on the brink of a battle that would determine its future. It was at this precise, precarious moment that the larger conflict convulsing the Roman world came crashing onto the shores of Egypt. Far away in Greece, at the Battle of Pharsalus, the two most powerful men in Rome, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, had fought their decisive battle. Caesar had been victorious. Pompey, his army shattered, fled for his life. He looked around the Mediterranean for a safe harbour, a place to regroup, and his eyes fell upon Egypt. He had good reason to expect a welcome there. He had been a powerful patron of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy III, and was, in the eyes of Roman law, the appointed guardian of the young heirs. He sailed towards the Egyptian coast, believing he would find sanctuary and support. When his ships appeared off the coast near Pelusium, where the two sibling armies were encamped, it sent a shockwave through the young king's command. Imagine the council of war in Ptolemy III's tent. Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus were faced with a terrible choice. To welcome Pompey, the loser of the Roman civil war, would be to invite the wrath of the victorious Caesar, who was known to be in hot pursuit. But to turn away a powerful Roman statesman like Pompey, their kingdom's official guardian, was also a grave insult that could have dire consequences. Theodotus, the tutor, is said to have grimly summarized their dilemma, arguing that if they welcomed Pompey, they would make an enemy of Caesar, and if they turned him away, they would make an enemy of Pompey, who might one day recover his strength. He proposed a third, ruthless solution, famously concluding, "A dead man cannot bite." They would murder Pompey, and in doing so, they believed they would both remove the immediate problem and earn the gratitude of the approaching Caesar. A small boat was sent out to Pompey's flagship. With false smiles and promises of a royal welcome, they lured the great Roman general away from the protection of his own men. As the boat neared the shore, while Pompey was reportedly reading a speech he had prepared for the young king, he was stabbed from behind and killed. His head was severed and preserved as a gift for Caesar. It was a brutal, shocking act of betrayal, a desperate gamble by a regime that felt its own grip on power slipping. Just a few days later, Julius Caesar's fleet arrived in Alexandria. He came not as a conqueror, but as a creditor and a pursuer of his final rival. He disembarked with a relatively small force, expecting a diplomatic resolution. He was led into the palace, and it was there that the advisors of the young king made their catastrophic miscalculation. With a flourish, they presented Caesar with the severed head of Pompey the Great. They expected gratitude, perhaps even praise for having eliminated his enemy for him. Instead, Caesar reacted with fury and disgust. Pompey had been his rival, his political opponent, and ultimately his enemy in war. But he had also been a great Roman, a former consul, and Caesar's one-time son-in-law. To see him so dishonorably murdered by a scheming foreign court was a profound insult to Roman dignity and to Caesar's own sense of clemency. This single, gruesome act gave Caesar the perfect pretext to do what he likely intended to do all along, to intervene decisively in the affairs of Egypt. He declared that as the official Roman consul and executor of Ptolemy XIII's will, he would settle the dispute between the warring siblings. He established himself in the royal palace, summoned the young Ptolemy XIII to his presence, and demanded that both sides lay down their arms. He was now the ultimate arbiter, the supreme power in Alexandria. The catalyst had arrived. The stage was now set for the exiled queen, hidden from view but waiting for her moment to make her own unforgettable entrance. The news of Caesar's arrival in Alexandria and his seizure of the palace would have reached Cleopatra's camp near Pelusium like a desert wind, swift and transformative. The chessboard had been overturned. Her brother and his council were now trapped in the capital, their authority suddenly subject to Roman whim. Her own army, facing the official Egyptian forces, was now part of a conflict that had become secondary. The primary struggle was no longer on the battlefield. It was in the mind of one man, Julius Caesar. Cleopatra understood this with perfect clarity. A frontal assault on Alexandria was impossible. The city's garrisons were loyal to her brother, and any attempt to fight her way to the palace would be a bloody, uncertain affair that would likely displease the order-obsessed Caesar. She had to reach him, but every conventional path was blocked. Her enemies controlled the city gates, the streets, and the very guards who stood watch over the palace walls. To enter Alexandria openly was to walk into a trap. And so a plan was formed. A plan of such audacity, such daring, that it has echoed through history for 2 millennia. It was a plan that relied not on the strength of an army, but on stealth, on ingenuity, and on a profound understanding of the man she needed to influence. She would not enter the palace as a queen at the head of a procession, but as a secret, delivered directly to the feet of power. Imagine the scene. A small, unremarkable fishing boat pushes off from the dark shoreline somewhere east of the great harbour of Alexandria. It is night. The grand marble buildings of the city are a pale silhouette against a sky dusted with stars. The sea is calm, its surface a dark glass reflecting the heavens. There are no royal banners on this boat, no gleaming bronze decorations. It is a simple vessel, crewed by a few trusted loyalists, and on its deck there is a long, bundled roll of what appears to be bedding, or perhaps a simple utilitarian carpet. Inside this bundle, wrapped in the coarse, unassuming fabric, lies the Queen of Egypt. Picture the confinement, the darkness. The only sensations are the gentle, rhythmic rocking of the boat, the muffled sound of water against the hull, and the hushed whispers of her companions. It is a moment of supreme vulnerability. Her fate, and the fate of her kingdom, rests on this simple deception, on the loyalty of a single man entrusted with her passage. That man was her faithful attendant, Apollodorus the Sicilian. It was he who shouldered the precious cargo when the small boat nudged against a quay near the royal palace. He would have walked with a steady, unhurried pace through the darkened streets, avoiding the Roman patrols and the watchmen loyal to Ptolemy XIII. The bundle on his back would have seemed heavy but unremarkable. A servant, perhaps, delivering bedding to a soldier or an official quartered within the palace complex. The most dangerous moment would have come at the palace gates. Roman legionaries, disciplined and suspicious, would have challenged him. Their armor would have caught the flickering torchlight, their faces stern and professional. Here, Apollodorus's performance had to be perfect. With a plausible story and a demeanor of utter normalcy, he had to convince them that his errand was mundane, his purpose harmless. He was granted entry. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, a place Cleopatra knew as her home, but which she was now forced to enter like a thief. The halls would have been quiet, the air cool against the stone. The flickering lamps would have cast long, dancing shadows. Finally, he reached the apartments where the Roman general had established his headquarters. He was brought before Caesar. Let us try to envision the room. Julius Caesar, a man in his early 50s, was at the height of his power. But the years of constant campaigning had left their mark. He was likely at a table, poring over maps or dispatches, the candlelight creating lines of shadow on his famously intense face. The air would have been filled with the scent of papyrus, of wax, and perhaps of the Roman leather from his campaign gear. He was a man of action, but also a man of letters, a pragmatist accustomed to long nights of work and strategic thought. Apollodorus, with a gesture of weary effort, would have heaved the long bundle from his shoulder and placed it on the floor. Caesar, perhaps annoyed at the interruption, would have looked on with a measure of curiosity. Then Apollodorus undid the ropes. He began to unroll the bundle. It was not a sudden, dramatic reveal. It was a slow unfolding. The rough, earthy fabric was pulled back layer by layer, and from the center of this humble cocoon, a figure emerged. Not a dusty soldier or a nervous petitioner, but a young woman. She was 21 years old, possessed of a quiet confidence that belied her precarious situation. The legends of later centuries would paint her as a breathtaking, irresistible beauty. But the contemporary accounts praise something else: her charm, her charisma, and the brilliance of her mind. What Caesar saw was not just a woman, but a ruler. She stood before him, in his private chambers, having utterly outmaneuvered every guard, every enemy, and every obstacle. And then she spoke. She did not plead or beg. She addressed him in Greek, the language of her court, which he spoke fluently. She presented her case with logic, with intelligence, and with an acute understanding of Roman politics. She argued her right to the throne as her father's eldest child. She would have explained the political situation in Alexandria, the characters and motivations of her enemies, and the strategic value of an alliance with a stable, friendly ruler of Egypt. She was not just asking for his help. She was offering him a solution to the chaotic problem he had found on his doorstep. For Caesar, a man who valued audacity and intellect above all else, this was a masterful performance. He was confronted not with a pawn in a dynastic squabble, but with a player. He saw in her a spirit that matched his own, bold, decisive, and willing to risk everything on a single brilliant gamble. Her courage was undeniable. Her intelligence was self-evident. In that quiet, candle-lit room, a profound shift occurred. The Roman general, the arbiter of Egypt's fate, had found his candidate. The gamble had succeeded. By morning, Cleopatra was no longer an exile. She was under the protection of Caesar, installed within the royal palace. Her brother, the young King Ptolemy III, awoke to discover that his hated sister had not only breached his defenses, but had captured the attention and admiration of the one man whose opinion now mattered more than any other. The secret, nighttime journey in a roll of carpet had completely redrawn the map of power in Egypt. The quiet intrigue was about to erupt into open conflict. The first light of dawn following Cleopatra's clandestine arrival did not bring peace. It brought confrontation. Imagine the scene within the palace. The young king, Ptolemy III, waking to the news that his sister was not only within the walls, but had gained the private ear of the Roman general. His reaction would have been one of furious disbelief, of deep humiliation. The careful web of control woven by his advisors, Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus, had been torn apart by a single, audacious act. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, attempted to restore a semblance of order. He summoned both Cleopatra and Ptolemy the Fiend before him, acting in his official capacity as executor of their father's will. He read the terms aloud, publicly reminding everyone that the intention was for them to rule jointly. He urged reconciliation, a public display of unity, but it was too late for that. The lines had been drawn too clearly, the betrayals felt too keenly. The young king, coached by his advisors, was incandescent with rage. The quiet power struggle had now become a public and irreversible breach. Pothinus, seeing his influence over the court evaporating and his control of the king slipping, made a desperate and fatalistic decision. He could not allow Caesar to simply install Cleopatra as the dominant power. He chose to escalate the conflict from a palace intrigue into a full-blown war. He gave the order to Achillas, the commander of the Egyptian army. The plan was simple and brutal. Unleash the 20,000 soldiers under his command, along with the volatile Alexandrian mob, upon Caesar's small, isolated force. Suddenly, the opulent royal quarter was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress under siege. Caesar, who had arrived as an arbiter, was now a prisoner in a gilded cage. He had with him only 2 legions, perhaps 9,000 men in total, a fraction of the forces arrayed against him. The vast, sprawling city of Alexandria, with its narrow, winding streets, was now enemy territory. The roar of the crowd, a sound that had once been distant background noise, now became a constant, menacing presence just beyond the palace walls. This was the beginning of the Alexandrian War. It was not a war of grand pitched battles in open fields, but a grueling street-by-street struggle for survival. Imagine Caesar, the master of strategy, forced into a defensive posture. He ordered his legionaries to fortify the royal quarter, turning palaces and gardens into barricaded strongpoints. From the high walls of the palace, he and Cleopatra could look out over the city. They would have seen the smoke rising from different districts, heard the confused clamor of urban warfare, and felt the tremors of siege engines attempting to batter down the walls. The fighting was chaotic and relentless. Achilles' forces controlled most of the city, including the great harbor. They tried to cut off Caesar's access to the sea, to trap him completely. Caesar, in a bold countermove, knew he had to control the waterways to have any hope of receiving supplies or reinforcements. This led to one of the most infamous and tragic events of this conflict. During the struggle for control of the docks, Caesar's men set fire to the Egyptian fleet moored in the harbor to prevent it from being used against them. It was a sound military tactic, but it had a devastating and likely unintended consequence. The fire, fanned by the sea breeze, spread from the ships to the buildings along the waterfront. Warehouses filled with grain and other goods were consumed by the blaze. And among these buildings, perilously close to the docks, were storehouses that formed part of the great library of Alexandria. Let us pause to consider this loss. It was not a single grand building that burned to the ground in a dramatic inferno. The great library was a complex, a part of the Mausion, the research institute. The scrolls, the collected wisdom of the Hellenistic world, were stored in various locations. What caught fire were likely warehouses containing a vast number of these scrolls, perhaps those destined for export or duplicates, or even a significant portion of the main collection. The accounts are conflicting and unclear, but the result was the same: a catastrophic loss of knowledge. Imagine the sight, not of screaming soldiers, but of the silent, irreplaceable work of poets, historians, and scientists turning to black ash. The smoke that drifted over the besieged palace was thick with the ghosts of lost ideas. A quiet tragedy that unfolded amidst the louder clamor of war. The siege dragged on for months. The quiet, predictable rhythm of Egyptian life was utterly broken. Within the palace, life became a tense routine of defense, of rationing, and of strategic planning. It was during these long, dangerous months that the alliance between Caesar and Cleopatra was forged in fire. They were bound together by a shared threat. They would have spent countless hours in discussion, he the seasoned general, she the insightful ruler with intimate knowledge of her city and its people. He would have seen her calm under pressure, her sharp intellect, and her unyielding resolve. She was not a liability to be protected. She was a partner in strategy. The tide began to turn, not in Alexandria, but from outside. A relief force, led by one of Caesar's allies, Mithridates of Pergamon, was marching overland towards Egypt. Learning of this, Caesar executed a daring plan. Leaving a small contingent to guard the palace, he secretly moved the bulk of his forces out of the city and linked up with the approaching army. Now, he was no longer the besieged, but the attacker. The final, decisive battle took place not in the city streets, but along the banks of the Nile. The army of Ptolemy Thnaith, led by Achilles, met Caesar's combined Roman and allied forces. The battle was fierce, but the discipline and experience of the Roman legions proved superior. The Ptolemaic army was broken and routed. In the chaos of the retreat, the young King Ptolemy III, only a boy of about 13, attempted to flee across the river in a boat, but the vessel was swamped with fleeing soldiers, overturned, and sank. The boy king, weighed down by his own golden armor, drowned in the muddy waters of the river that had sustained his ancestors for millennia. It was a quiet, ignominious end, a footnote to a war he had been pushed into by others. Pothinus, the chief architect of the war, had been executed by Caesar earlier in the siege. The entire regime that had opposed Cleopatra was now gone. Caesar returned to Alexandria as the undisputed conqueror. The war was over. He entered the city not as a besieged defender, but as its master. The remaining Alexandrian forces surrendered, and the populace, weary of war, accepted his authority. Now, he had to settle the governance of this vital kingdom. He did not, however, make Cleopatra the sole, absolute ruler. In a typically Roman move, he adhered to the letter of her father's will while maintaining a check on her power. He declared that she would rule jointly with her next surviving brother, the even younger Ptolemy XIV, a boy of about 11. In reality, this was a formality. Cleopatra was the true power, her authority now cemented by Roman arms. Her younger brother was a co-ruler in name only, a placeholder to satisfy tradition and to remind Cleopatra that her power was ultimately guaranteed by Rome. With peace restored and his ally firmly on the throne, the nature of Caesar's stay in Egypt changed. The grim siege gave way to a period of consolidation, and, for Caesar, a much-needed respite. It was now that he and Cleopatra embarked on a legendary journey, a grand tour up the Nile. Imagine a magnificent gilded barge, a floating palace, moving slowly against the river's current. It would have been a spectacle of immense political importance. For the people of Egypt, living in the timeless villages and temple towns along the river, it was a display of power. It showed their queen, triumphant, endorsed by the most powerful man in the world, moving through their lands not as a Greek monarch from Alexandria, but as a true pharaoh making a royal procession. On this slow, meandering journey, surrounded by the serene and ancient landscapes of Upper Egypt, the political alliance deepened into a personal one. The 52-year-old general and the 22-year-old queen spent weeks together, away from the pressures of the court. We can only imagine their conversations as they drifted past the colossal temples of Thebes and the quiet, sun-baked fields. The result of this union was tangible and profound. Shortly after Caesar departed from Egypt, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but he would be known to history by his nickname, Caesarion, Little Caesar. The name was a declaration. This child was not just a Ptolemaic heir. He was the living link between the ancient lineage of the pharaohs and the new power of Rome. For Cleopatra, he was the ultimate security for her dynasty. For Caesar, he was a complication and a whispered rumor that would follow him back to Rome, a city that was deeply suspicious of kings and foreign queens. The price of her throne had been a war that ravaged her capital and a permanent entanglement in the affairs of Rome. But she had emerged victorious. Her enemies were dead, her rule was secure, and she had a son by the master of the Roman world. After the crucible of the Alexandrian War, with her throne secured and her son, Caesarion, at her side, Cleopatra's world entered a new phase. The immediate danger had passed, but the future of her dynasty now depended entirely on its connection to Rome, and specifically to one man. And so, in the year 46 BCE, Cleopatra made a journey that was in its own way as bold as her arrival in a carpeted role. She traveled to the heart of power itself. She went to Rome. This was not the journey of a defeated monarch being paraded in chains. She arrived as the head of a diplomatic mission, an allied queen visiting the capital of her great protector. With her came her vast entourage, her nominal co-ruler and young brother, Ptolemy X, and most importantly, her infant son, the living, breathing symbol of her Roman alliance. Her purpose was clear: to solidify her status, to have her rule and the status of her son formally recognized by the Roman Senate, and to be present at the center of the world her kingdom was now irrevocably tied to. Imagine her arrival, not into the city of Rome itself, for Roman tradition, born of a deep-seated hatred of kings, forbade a foreign monarch from entering within the city's sacred boundary, the Pomerium. To do so would have been an intolerable provocation. Instead, Caesar provided for her and her court in one of his own private villas. It was a magnificent estate, with sprawling gardens, situated on the other side of the Tiber River, offering a stunning view of the city she could not enter. Here, on Roman soil, she recreated a small piece of Alexandria. The air in her gardens would have been thick with the scent of exotic plants and blossoms unfamiliar to the Romans. The halls would have been filled with Greek art, with scholars from the Moussaillon, with the sounds of a language and a culture that was older, and in many ways more refined, than that of their powerful hosts. It was a world of quiet, Hellenistic luxury and intellectual pursuit, set down just across the water from the bustling, noisy, and increasingly dangerous heart of the Roman Republic. Let us try to picture the Rome she saw from her gilded cage. It was a city of stark, magnificent contradictions. It was the capital of a world-spanning empire, yet it was also a place of political chaos. Caesar was at the absolute zenith of his power. He was celebrating an unprecedented 4 triumphs, military parades celebrating his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The streets would have been thronged with crowds, the air filled with the sounds of celebration and the sight of immense looted wealth being paraded through the forum. But beneath this triumphant surface, the city seethed with tension. The ancient aristocratic families who had guided the Republic for centuries looked upon Caesar with deep resentment and fear. His power was absolute, his style autocratic. He was disrupting all the old traditions, and his popularity with the common people in the army only deepened the elite's suspicion. The quiet conversations in the villas of the powerful were filled with whispers of tyranny, of a republic on the verge of collapse, of one man's ambition grown too great. Into this cauldron of political anxiety stepped Cleopatra. For the average Roman citizen, she was a figure of immense curiosity, the exotic queen from the fabulously wealthy land of Egypt, the paramour of their great general. But for the Roman elite, she was something else entirely. She was a threat. They saw in her the embodiment of everything they feared and despised: monarchy, luxury, and the decadent, corrupting influence of the East. And she was a woman who held undeniable influence over Caesar, a fact that was both baffling and deeply insulting to their patriarchal sensibilities. The great orator and statesman Cicero, writing in his private letters, drips with contempt for her. He speaks of her arrogance, of her pride. He could not stand the sight of this foreign queen living in splendor so close to their city. His feelings were a reflection of a wider sentiment among the senatorial class. They saw her not as a strategic partner, but as a temptress who was leading their great Caesar astray. The gossip was relentless, focusing on her relationship with Caesar, and most alarmingly, on the child, Caesarion. Was this boy truly Caesar's son? Did she intend for him to have a claim on Rome itself? The idea was monstrous to them. Caesar, for his part, did little to quell these fears. In a move of staggering boldness, he commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra, and he had it placed not just in any public space, but within the sacred precincts of the new temple of Venus Genetrix. This was the temple he himself had built, dedicated to the mythical goddess from whom his own Julian clan claimed direct descent. By placing a statue of his foreign mistress, depicted as the goddess Isis, next to the cult statue of his own divine ancestor, he was making a public statement of shocking audacity. He was linking the Egyptian queen and, by extension her son, to his own divine heritage. To his enemies, this was the ultimate proof. This was the act of a man who no longer thought like a Roman official, but like a Hellenistic king. The statue was not just an honor, it was a provocation. And so, Cleopatra waited. Imagine her days in the villa across the river. She was surrounded by every comfort, living in a style of opulence that rivaled her own palace in Alexandria. She was the guest of the most powerful man on earth. Yet she was profoundly isolated. She could not participate in the political life of the city. She could not walk the forum or speak in the Senate. She was an observer, watching the great drama of the dying republic play out from a distance. Her power, her security, the very life of her son, all depended on the survival and continued goodwill of one man. The beautiful villa was not a home, it was a waiting room. The tension in Rome grew. In early 44 BCE, Caesar was named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. This was the final straw for the conspirators, who saw this as the death of the republic and the birth of a formal monarchy. The whispers in the aristocratic villas grew into a concrete plot. For Cleopatra, watching from her gardens, the political climate must have been a source of ever-increasing dread. Every rumor, every new honor granted to Caesar was a double-edged sword, elevating her protector while simultaneously increasing the danger to his life. Then came the Ides of March, the 15th of the month, 44 BCE. We can imagine the news arriving at her villa, not as a clear, concise report, but as a wave of confusion and panic spreading from the city. Shouts carrying across the water, servants running with fragmented, terrifying stories. Caesar had been attacked in the Senate house itself. He had been stabbed, he was dead. In a single afternoon, Cleopatra's world was shattered. The entire foundation of her security, the source of her authority, the protector of her kingdom and her son, was gone. The man who had dominated the world was dead, murdered by his own colleagues, and his assassins were now the new power in Rome. The city, which had been her golden cage, was suddenly a death trap. She, the foreign queen, the symbol of Caesar's perceived tyranny, was now in a position of extreme danger. Her enemies in the Senate would show her no mercy. Her departure from Rome was the mirror image of her arrival. There was no grand procession, no diplomatic formality. It was a quiet, hurried flight. She gathered her household, her son, her brother, and slipped away, retreating back across the sea to the one place she could still feel safe, her own kingdom. She had come to Rome to secure the future of her dynasty. She left with that future more perilous and uncertain than ever before. The great love story, the story of alliance and power, was over, but its consequences, and the existence of the boy named Caesarion, would cast a long shadow over the next chapter of her life, and over the new civil war that was about to engulf the Roman world once again. The hurried flight from Rome was a return to the one place on earth where Cleopatra was not a guest or a political pawn, but a sovereign. Imagine the relief of breathing the Alexandrian air again, of seeing the familiar white marble of her own palaces, of hearing the Greek and Egyptian tongues of her own people. The danger of Rome was now across the sea, but the profound uncertainty it had created now permeated everything. Her first priority upon returning was not mourning, but survival. The political landscape of her own court required immediate and decisive action. Her younger brother, Ptolemy IV, was no longer a boy. He was a teenager of about 15, and in the cutthroat world of Hellenistic politics, a male co-ruler, no matter how passive, was a potential rallying point for any faction that might seek to challenge her authority. He had been a necessary piece of political theatre for Caesar, but Caesar was gone. The boy was now a liability. History is quiet on the precise details of what happened next, but the outcome was stark and unambiguous. Shortly after their return to Egypt, Ptolemy XIV died. The official cause was likely recorded as a sudden illness, a common enough occurrence in the ancient world, but few in the court or in the wider world would have believed it was a coincidence. For Cleopatra, it was a grim but necessary act of consolidation. It was the removal of a rival, a closing of a door to internal dissent. We need not imagine a scene of high drama, but a quiet, calculated decision made in the cool halls of the palace. A political problem solved with the cold finality that her dynasty had so often employed. It was a stark reminder that beneath the charm and intellect was a ruler forged in a ruthless world. With her brother gone, Cleopatra immediately moved to fill the political vacuum. She did not seek to rule alone, which would have been a perpetual challenge to tradition. Instead, she elevated her own son, the 3-year-old Caesarion, to the throne as her co-ruler. He was formally named Ptolemy XV Caesar. Imagine the scene at his coronation. A small child, dwarfed by the ancient crowns and regalia of the pharaohs, proclaimed king alongside his mother. This was an act of breathtaking political significance. It was a message sent both to her own people and to the fractured Roman world. To the Egyptians, it presented the dynasty as secure, with a male heir ready to continue the line. But the name, Ptolemy Caesar, was aimed directly at Rome. It was a defiant declaration that Caesar's legacy lived on in Egypt. It was a claim, subtle but undeniable, that her son was the true heir of the great dictator, a direct challenge to the men now scrambling for power in Italy. She was binding her own legitimacy, and that of her kingdom, to the most powerful name in the Roman consciousness. While Cleopatra secured her own kingdom, the Roman world had descended into a new and even more vicious civil war. The vacuum left by Caesar's death was being filled by two opposing factions. On one side were the liberators, the senators led by Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's assassins. They had fled east, to Greece and the provinces of Asia Minor, seeking to gather armies and resources to restore the old republic as they saw it. On the other side were the Caesarians, the avengers of his murder. This faction was led by two men: Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted and brilliant general, a man of immense military skill and appetites to match, and a new, unexpected player, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, a cold, calculating, and ruthlessly ambitious young man of 19, whom Caesar had named as his primary heir in his will. For Cleopatra, this was an impossibly dangerous situation. Both sides knew that Egypt was the greatest prize in the Mediterranean. It possessed immense wealth, a powerful fleet, and most critically, a vast surplus of grain that could feed hungry armies and restless populations. Both sides sent emissaries to Alexandria, demanding support. To side with the liberators, Brutus and Cassius, was unthinkable. They were the men who had murdered her protector and the father of her son. But to openly side with Antony and Octavian was a tremendous gamble. Their victory was far from assured, and if they lost, the triumphant liberators would surely turn their full fury upon her kingdom. So Cleopatra did what any intelligent ruler in an impossible position would do. She played for time. She engaged in a delicate and masterful game of strategic ambiguity. When envoys from Cassius came demanding ships and money, she prevaricated. She spoke of plagues sweeping through her kingdom, of famines and internal unrest, making it impossible to offer the aid they required. These may not have been complete fabrications, but their severity was likely exaggerated to serve a political purpose. At the same time, she offered nominal support to the Caesarian faction. There were 4 Roman legions stationed in Egypt, veterans left behind by Caesar. She formally released these legions to go and support the Caesarians. It was a significant gesture, but also a clever one. It removed a powerful, independent Roman military force from her kingdom. strengthening her own control, while demonstrating her loyalty to Caesar's cause without committing her own Egyptian forces. She was walking a tightrope, trying to appear loyal to one side without becoming a primary target for the other. Imagine the constant tension in the Alexandrian court, the careful reading of dispatches from abroad, the weighing of rumors, the endless calculations of risk and reward. It was a period not of romance or adventure, but of quiet, intense political chess. The fate of the Roman world, and by extension her own, came to a head in the autumn of 42 BCE, on the plains of Philippi in northern Greece. There, the armies of Antony and Octavian met the forces of Brutus and Cassius in two brutal battles. The result was a decisive victory for the Caesarians. Brutus and Cassius, their armies shattered, both took their own lives. The dream of restoring the old republic died with them. The news of the victory at Philippi would have brought a sense of cautious relief to Alexandria. The immediate threat from her sworn enemies was gone, but the Roman world was now in the hands of three men, the victors who formed the second triumvirate: Mark Antony, the young Octavian, and a third, lesser general named Lepidus. They carved up the empire between them. Octavian returned to the turbulent world of Italy to settle the veterans. Lepidus was given the provinces of Africa, and Mark Antony took for himself the most glamorous and wealthy portion, the East. Suddenly, Cleopatra had a new Roman master on her doorstep. Mark Antony was now the supreme authority in all the lands that bordered her kingdom. He was tasked with reorganizing the provinces, rewarding allies, punishing enemies, and above all, raising the vast sums of money needed to pay for the war and to fund the triumvirate's continued rule. And the wealthiest client state in his new domain was, of course, Egypt. Antony established his headquarters in the city of Tarsus, in Cilicia, part of modern-day Turkey. From there, he began to summon the various client rulers of the East. They were called to come before him, to answer for their conduct during the war, and to make arrangements for the contributions they would be expected to make to the Roman treasury. It was a series of command performances, and then the inevitable summons arrived in Alexandria, a message from Mark Antony requesting the presence of the Queen of Egypt. She was to come to Tarsus to answer certain charges that had been leveled against her, namely, that she had secretly given aid to the cause of Cassius. The charge was likely a pretext. The true purpose was clear. The new master of the East wanted to meet the famous queen, to assess her for himself, and to determine how much of her kingdom's vast wealth he could extract. For Cleopatra, this was a moment of immense peril, but also of opportunity. She was once again being called to account by a powerful Roman general. The last time this had happened with Caesar, she had been a desperate exile. This time, she was the secure and established ruler of a stable kingdom. But the man she was about to meet was not Caesar. Antony was a different kind of man. A brilliant soldier, yes, but also a man known for his grand passions, his love of spectacle, his appreciation for luxury and pleasure. She would have gathered every piece of information she could about him, analyzing his character, his weaknesses, and his ambitions. She knew that this meeting could not be that of a subordinate reporting to a superior. She had to control the narrative, just as she had done with Caesar. But she would not be arriving in a carpet this time. Her entrance would be a spectacle of power and allure, designed to captivate the man who now held her future in his hands. Mark Antony waited in Tarsus. Imagine the city, a bustling provincial capital in what is now southern Turkey. It was a place of commerce and administration, filled with Roman officials, Greek merchants, and local Cilicians. Antony had established his headquarters there, and the city's central marketplace, the Agora, was his court. Day after day, he sat on a raised tribunal, hearing cases, receiving petitions, and accepting the obeisance of the local potentates who scurried to his side. He had summoned the Queen of Egypt, and he expected her to arrive as the others had, as a petitioner, a subordinate coming to answer to a Roman master. But Cleopatra did not come. The days passed. Messengers were sent, and polite but firm replies came back. The Queen was making her preparations. She would arrive when she was ready. This was the first move in her carefully orchestrated performance. She was subtly shifting the balance of power, making it clear that she was not just another client ruler to be summoned at a whim. She was making the great Mark Antony wait. And then, one afternoon, a new kind of rumor began to ripple through the noisy marketplace. It started as a whisper among the dockworkers and sailors down by the river Cydnus, which flowed through the city. A strange and magnificent vessel was making its way upriver. As the rumor grew, people began to drift away from the Agora. The crowds thinned. The petitioners fell silent. Soon Mark Antony found himself sitting almost alone on his tribunal. The business of the day forgotten. The entire city had gone to the riverbank to witness the arrival of the Queen of Egypt. Humbled and intrigued, Antony had no choice but to follow. What he saw there was not a warship or a royal transport. It was a scene deliberately crafted from mythology and poetry. A spectacle designed not just to impress, but to enchant and disarm. Let us paint the picture of this moment, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, dreamlike unfolding. Drifting gently up the river was a great barge. Its stern was gilded with gold, catching the warm afternoon sunlight and casting a soft, shimmering glow upon the water. Its sails were not the coarse linen of a working vessel, but a deep, rich purple, the colour of royalty, so expensive a dye that it was reserved for the highest echelons of power. But what would have captured the senses first was not the sight, but the sound and the scent. The air, thick with the river's earthy smell, was suddenly filled with the sweet, pervasive perfume of burning incense, drifting from silver censers on the deck. And accompanying this was the sound of music. Not the brassy blast of military trumpets, but the gentle, ethereal notes of flutes, pipes, and lyres, playing a soft, hypnotic melody. The vessel was propelled not by wind alone, but by a rhythmic, almost silent motion. The great oars were plated with silver, and they dipped into the water in a slow, steady cadence. And the rowers themselves were not hardened sailors or slaves, but young women from Cleopatra's court, dressed in the guise of sea nymphs and graces. And there, on the deck, under a canopy embroidered with gold thread, reclined Cleopatra herself. She was not dressed in the severe robes of a monarch coming to a political negotiation. She had staged herself as a living tableau. She was dressed as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, a deity the Romans knew as Venus. It was a brilliant, multi-layered choice. She was aligning herself not with power in a masculine sense, but with a divine, irresistible feminine force. It was at once alluring and deeply political. It was a nod to Antony's own fondness for associating himself with the god Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, creating a mythological pairing before a single word had been spoken. When Antony was finally invited aboard the barge that evening, the performance continued. The vessel was lit by countless lamps, their light reflecting off the silver and gold, creating a magical, otherworldly atmosphere. The feast she had prepared was not merely a meal, it was a display of the inexhaustible wealth of Egypt. Every dish, every goblet, every piece of silver was of the finest craftsmanship. The conversation, we are told, was sparkling and intelligent. Cleopatra was a famously witty and engaging conversationalist, able to charm and hold her own with a man like Antony, who appreciated sharp humor and confident banter. She had completely reversed the expected dynamic. Antony had summoned her to his tribunal to answer charges. Instead, she had summoned him to her barge, to a world of her own creation, where she was not a defendant, but a goddess holding court. She had outmaneuvered him with spectacle and psychology. This first meeting set the tone for their relationship. The political alliance, which was the true purpose of the meeting, was quickly cemented. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to pay his legions and fund his future ambitions. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection to guarantee her kingdom's independence and the succession of her son, Caesarion. Their goals were perfectly aligned. They were natural partners. But what blossomed from this political necessity was a genuine affinity. In Antony, Cleopatra found a man who was, in many ways, her equal in spirit. Unlike the cerebral, calculating Caesar, Antony was a man of grand gestures, of immense appetites, and of a certain romantic, swashbuckling charisma. He was a man who understood and appreciated the kind of lavish, theatrical world that she inhabited so naturally. For Antony, the winter he spent with her in Alexandria, following their meeting in Tarsus, was an escape from the grim, backstabbing world of Roman politics. Imagine that winter in Alexandria. Life for Antony and Cleopatra became a rolling festival, a deliberate performance of pleasure and power. They formed a society they called the Inimitable Livers, dedicating themselves to a daily round of elaborate feasts, wine-fueled parties, and extravagant entertainments. They would wander the city streets at night in disguise, playing pranks on the citizenry, indulging a shared sense of playful mischief. For Antony, it was a world away from the cold, austere ambition of his rival Octavian back in Rome. Alexandria was a paradise of pleasure, and Cleopatra was its captivating queen. Yet we must not mistake this for simple hedonism. Every feast, every public display was also a political act. It demonstrated the wealth and stability of Cleopatra's kingdom. It bound Antony to her, not just with affection, but with a lifestyle that he could not find anywhere else. It solidified their partnership in the minds of the Egyptian people and the watching world. This partnership also produced tangible results. 3 years after their meeting, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy she named Alexander Helios for the sun, and a girl she named Cleopatra Selene for the moon. The names were symbolic, cosmic, linking their dynasty to the heavens themselves. However, this deep political and personal alliance, which seemed so successful in the East, was viewed with profound suspicion and hostility in Rome. The stories that trickled back to Italy were not of a strategic partnership, but of a great Roman general who had been ensnared by a foreign sorceress. Octavian, Antony's cold and brilliant rival, was a master of propaganda. He began to skillfully craft a narrative for the Roman people. Antony was no longer a Roman hero. He was a man who had forgotten his duty, gone native, and surrendered his Roman virtue to the decadent luxuries of an Egyptian queen. Their love, their alliance, their children, all of it was used as a weapon against them, challenging Rome's authority and setting the stage for the final, inevitable confrontation that would decide the fate of their world. The years that Antony and Cleopatra spent together in the East were the zenith of their shared power, a period where their dream of a stable, dominant Eastern empire seemed within their grasp. But every action they took, every declaration they made echoed back to Rome, where Octavian was methodically turning public opinion into a weapon. The final act of their story was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, deliberate unraveling, set in motion by a single, magnificent, and catastrophic political event. This event was the donations of Alexandria. In the autumn of 34 BCE, Antony staged a grand public ceremony in the heart of his partner's capital. It was a spectacle designed to rival a Roman triumph. Imagine a vast gymnasium filled with the people of Alexandria. On a silver tribunal sat Antony and Cleopatra side by side, enthroned like gods. She was dressed in the sacred robes of the goddess Isis. Below them, on lower thrones, sat their children, the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and their youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Beside them, given a place of supreme honor, was the now teenaged Caesarion. Here, Antony made a series of stunning proclamations. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings, a title that placed her above all other client rulers. He proclaimed her son Caesarion to be the true, legitimate son of Julius Caesar and named him King of Kings. This was a direct, public challenge to Octavian, whose entire claim to power was based on his status as Caesar's adopted son and heir. Then, Antony proceeded to distribute the kingdoms of the East, many of which were not yet even conquered, among his own children with Cleopatra. Alexander Helios was named ruler of Armenia and lands beyond the Euphrates. His infant brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was given Syria and most of Asia Minor, and Cleopatra Selene was made queen of Cyrenaica and Libya. For Antony and Cleopatra, this was the logical culmination of their vision. A new world order in the East, ruled by their dynasty, in partnership with Rome. But for Octavian, it was the ultimate gift of propaganda. He now had the final, undeniable proof he needed to convince the Roman Senate and people of what he had been claiming for years. Antony, he argued, was no longer a Roman. He had given away Roman lands to a foreign woman and her illegitimate children. He planned to disinherit Rome and move the capital of the empire from the Tiber to the Nile. He was a man bewitched, a traitor to his own people. The propaganda war reached its peak. Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins in Rome and read its contents aloud to the Senate. The will reportedly confirmed Antony's desire to be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria, a detail that, to the Romans, signaled his complete abandonment of his homeland. The narrative was set. This was not to be a civil war between two Roman generals. Octavian skillfully framed it as a foreign war. Rome, the defender of tradition and virtue, against the decadent, corrupting threat of the Egyptian queen. In late 32 BCE, Rome officially declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a political masterstroke. Antony, by standing with her, was forced into the position of defending a foreign power against his own state. The two sides gathered their forces for the final confrontation. An immense fleet, a combined force of Antony and Cleopatra's ships, assembled on the western coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant and innovative general, Marcus Agrippa, moved to meet them. The fate of the world would be decided at sea. The decisive battle took place on September 2nd, 31st BCE, in the waters just outside the Gulf of Actium. Let us not imagine a scene of chaos and screaming, but a vast and terrible tableau. Hundreds of ships, great heavy quinqueremes on Antony's side, and smaller, more nimble vessels on Octavian's, met on the placid blue water under a late summer sun. For hours the battle was a stalemate, a slow, grinding contest of attrition. Then, for reasons that historians still debate, the course of the battle, and of history, changed. A squadron of 60 ships, the powerful Egyptian contingent commanded directly by Cleopatra, was seen raising its sails. They had been held in reserve behind the main line of battle. Now they were sailing away from the fight, heading south. It may have been a prearranged plan to break through a blockade, or a panicked response to the battle's grim reality. We will never know for certain. What is certain is what happened next. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's flagship sailing away, made a fateful decision. He abandoned his own massive flagship, which was still locked in combat, transferred to a smaller, faster vessel, and followed her. He left his fleet, his army, and his honor behind him. For his soldiers and sailors, who watched their commander desert them in the middle of a battle, it was a moment of utter demoralization. The chain of command was broken. Antony's fleet, leaderless and confused, fought on, but their resistance eventually collapsed. By the end of the day, Octavian had won a complete and catastrophic victory. The war was effectively over. The flight of Antony and Cleopatra back to Alexandria was not the hurried, strategic retreat of a monarch. It was the desperate flight of a defeated couple whose world had just collapsed. When they arrived in Egypt, the atmosphere was one of profound doom. They sent desperate messages to Octavian, trying to negotiate. Cleopatra offered to abdicate in favor of her children. Antony asked only to be allowed to live as a private citizen in Egypt. Octavian's response was cold silence. He wanted unconditional surrender. Knowing their fate was sealed, they dissolved the inimitable livers. In its place, they formed a new society, a testament to their despair, the companions to the death. It was a suicide pact, a promise that they would die together rather than fall into the hands of Octavian. They spent their final months in a state of quiet, fatalistic resignation, waiting for the end. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's legions arrived at the gates of Alexandria. The last of Antony's forces either surrendered or deserted. The end had come. The final hours of their lives are shrouded in the fog of Roman accounts, designed to diminish them even in death. According to the story, a false report was sent to Antony that Cleopatra had already taken her own life in her mausoleum, a great tomb she had built for herself. In despair, Antony asked his servant to kill him. When the servant killed himself instead, Antony fell on his own sword. But the wound was not immediately fatal. In his final agonizing moments, he learned that Cleopatra was, in fact, still alive, barricaded in her tomb. He was carried to her, and his last loyal guards hoisted his dying body up the walls and through a window into her arms, where he died. Cleopatra was now alone, a captive of Octavian. She was allowed to preside over Antony's burial. She then retired to her own palace. Her final goal was singular: to control her own death and deny Octavian his ultimate prize. The sight of her, the great queen, being paraded through the streets of Rome in chains as the centerpiece of his triumph. How she accomplished this remains a quiet mystery. The legend, immortalized by Shakespeare, is that she had an asp, a venomous snake, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. It is a powerful, poetic image, fitting for a queen who associated herself with the goddess Isis, whose symbol was the serpent. But many historians are skeptical. Other, more plausible theories suggest a fast-acting poison, perhaps hidden within a hollow hairpin or comb, which she could have administered to herself without detection. The method is less important than the result. She was found on her golden bed, dressed in her full royal regalia, looking not like a defeated victim, but like a queen asleep. Her two most faithful handmaidens lay dead beside her. She was 39 years old. Her final act was one of defiance, a quiet assertion of her sovereignty over her own body and her own destiny. With her death, the story of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, came to an end. Egypt became a Roman province. Her children with Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Antony's spurned wife, Octavia. A final, ironic twist. Her son by Caesar, the 17-year-old Caesarion, king of kings, was hunted down and executed by Octavian. 2 Caesars are one too many, he is said to have remarked. In the centuries that followed, the story of Cleopatra was reshaped. Octavian's propaganda became the first draft of history. Roman poets and historians cemented the image of the seductive, decadent foreign queen who nearly brought Rome to its knees. Over time, this hostile narrative slowly softened, transformed by poets and playwrights into one of the most enduring tragic love stories of all time. But this legend, in its focus on passion, often obscures the quieter truth we have explored tonight. The story of a brilliant, multilingual, and politically astute ruler, a strategist and a survivor, who skillfully navigated a treacherous world for more than 2 decades, fighting to preserve the independence of her ancient kingdom against the inexorable tide of Roman conquest. Her story is not just one of love, but of a constant, quiet struggle against a fate that was, in the end, inescapable.